Hello, everyone, and welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I am Heather Auden, Director of Alumni Engagement at York. Thank you for joining us for today's session, Drinking Water Management in Nunavut. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I am on. Because we may not be gathered in the same place, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be the same territory that you are on. So please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now, before we get to our guest today, we'd like to conduct a quick poll before the session begins. So the question for everyone is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? You should see it on your screen right now. I'm going to give you all a moment to respond. And thank you very much for that, as it is helpful for our speakers to know more about our audience. Okay. So if at any time during the Zoom webinar, feel free to click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you need any help, you can enter your question there. Our team is ready to help you. The same button may be used to submit questions for our guest speaker to answer during the Q&A period. Please do note that all your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and staff working behind the scenes, so we ask that you keep your comments relevant and respectful. Okay, now without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Stephanie Gora. Stephanie works as an assistant professor at York University, where she leads the Safe and Sustainable Water Research Group and teaches courses related to water resources engineering, water process design, and engineering design principles. Her team's research is focused on light-based technologies for drinking water and wastewater treatment. The team also works on projects that aim to develop sustainable drinking water solutions for small, remote, and underserved communities, particularly in Inuit Nunavut. Dr. Gora holds a PhD from the University of Toronto and is registered as a professional engineer with Engineers Nova Scotia and Professional Engineers Ontario. Welcome, Dr. Gora. Great.
Hi.
And I will let you share your screen, and I will be back after your presentation for the Q&A. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, so thank you all so much for attending this talk. I'm hoping to get through a few things today, mostly give everybody kind of a general introduction about how water is managed in Canada, how it is managed in Northern Canada, and then walk you through a few case studies just to explain some of the work that my team has been doing or that I did previously in a previous position. And then I'd also like to, I guess, talk a bit about some other solutions that are coming up, as well as some of the inherent challenges of doing work the kind of work that my team does. Okay, so let's go for it. Before we actually do go for it, though, I want to introduce a few people. My team is very collaborative, and in particular, I work with one of my PhD students, Caroline Duncan, who, when it comes to this Arctic research, I consider her a partner on equal standing with me. She has really driven the development of this program, and is just, the energy she puts into it is incredible. So I want to make sure that was acknowledged early on, because some of the work I'm going to be presenting is work that really could not have been done without her doing what she does. We also have a lot of people we collaborate with, both at the government of Nunavut, Nunavut Association of Municipalities, individual community members and other stakeholders in different communities that I or my team have worked in, as well as our youth water samplers who we worked with in our project in Cambridge Bay. You'll hear a bit more about that later on. Okay, so let's start with the big picture. How do we manage drinking water in Canada? So I think most of you, if you're living in southern Canada, you're probably, at least generally familiar with how this works. So we get our water, whether we get it from a river or a lake or a groundwater source. We pump it out, we bring it to a water treatment plant where it is exposed to a number of different treatment processes, including things like filtration and chlorination. Then it goes into various water storage tanks and underground reservoirs where it basically waits until it's needed in the community, and then it gets sent out to the different buildings that are around the community. And this includes private homes and small buildings, industrial users, large buildings, and various other users. So we call this basically a centralized system. And one of the really important parts of this system is that the water gets transferred to the different buildings via underground pipes. Now, it's complicated, right? The way we manage drinking water in Canada or anywhere, there's a lot of people involved, right? So we have different groups that develop drinking water standards and regulations. So that's basically like what we have to do in order to treat water. What are the rules and laws? We have environmental protection, which comes into, how is our source water doing? Are we protecting the river? Are we protecting the lake? We have people who take care of the infrastructure. So is that, that's the water treatment plant, the pipes, everything else, as well as operating and maintaining that infrastructure. A really important part of how we manage drinking water in Canada is that we take a multi-barrier approach. Now, this is an approach that was developed by a group at Health Canada. And the idea is that clean and safe drinking water is not just a matter of the source water. It's not just a matter of the treatment. It's not just a matter of the distribution and storage, although of course all of those are really important. It also comes down to monitoring water quality and the system. It comes down to managing and operating it correctly. There's engagement with the public. People have to know what's going on, and there's different provinces have found different ways of doing this. There's all those water quality guidelines, standards, and objectives. So that's making sure that there is a map that people can follow to ensure safe drinking water. There's research, science, and technology, which is where I spent most of my career, developing new methods or understanding things in different ways. And there's obviously, government policy and legislation that come into it. Now, what does this look like in northern Canada? And my talk today focuses on Nunavut, but there's actually a lot of similar things that occur in different parts of the Arctic. So one of the important differences, something that really does set this apart, is that all of the communities in Nunavut have at least some aspects of their system that are what we call truck and cistern systems. Some of them also have some combination of underground and above ground pipes, but most communities in the territory rely on trucks to distribute the water. So like in southern Canada, there's a water source. In Nunavut, all of the water sources are surface water, so either a river or a lake or a reservoir. The water gets sent to a treatment plant where it might be treated with various different approaches. So many of these systems include filtration, some do not. All have some level of disinfection, whether that be UV disinfection or chlorine disinfection. The water is then dispensed into a truck, and the truck drives around from building to building where it connects to the building and puts water into a storage tank. And then once the water's in the storage tank, the experience within, say, the house is very similar to what you'd have in the South. So, you turn on the tap and water comes out, you do your laundry. The difference is that you always have to be keeping an eye on what's going on because you could run out of water. And my personal nightmare is running out of water is bad, but overfilling the sewage tank, oh man. So this is just something that's like an extra layer of having to be aware of what's going on with your drinking water as someone who's just a resident who's using it. But it also introduces complexity in terms of water safety because we have all these steps that we don't have in southern systems or in centralized systems that have to be considered. And a lot of the water safety risks in these different sections, by which I'm specifically talking about the truck and the storage tank, are just not that well understood. Part of that is just there aren't a lot of communities in the north, right? There's millions and millions and millions of people in southern Canada. We have a lot of opportunity to study the challenges here. But when it comes to the north, there are fewer communities, fewer people, and this area of inquiry is kind of just getting going. Now, in Nunavut, there are also a number of stakeholders. I'm not going to get through all of these groups, but if you take a quick look at the slide, there's a lot of the same types of groups that are involved, but they are territory specific. Now, in Nunavut specifically, there are vulnerabilities related to both the quantity or amount of water available, as well as the quality. And these are being exacerbated by climate change. A lot of you will know that the North is kind of disproportionately impacted by climate change. So the temperatures are changing more quickly in the North than they are in the South. And this has some major implications for water availability and also water quality. And this is really important because water shortages have already occurred in Nunavut communities. You've probably heard about this in Iqaluit, which has had multiple experiences of actually literally running out of water. And they aren't the only community. Many communities in the territory are very vulnerable to running out of water at some point during the year, which is catastrophic. There's also water quality vulnerability. And part of that, again, is going to be exacerbated by climate change. So this is just a figure from a paper that was done by another group, just showing all of the different impacts that climate change and warming is likely to have on different elements of the Arctic hydrological cycle. And then the last square there, where there's the arrows and the circles, that's giving some information about what we think is going to change in terms of water quality. So in some places, we're likely to see changing amounts of particles or nutrients or dissolved organic carbon, which is what DOC means. So all of these things are currently, in flux, and this introduces, again, another level of complexity and challenge in terms of providing safe water. It's already difficult to provide safe water when we know what's going on in the water source, but when there's a lot of change happening, this gets even more difficult. Okay, so this is a known thing, and there are very dedicated people working at the government of Nunavut and in communities trying to better understand these challenges and come up with ways to address them. And so one important step in that direction was the Nunavut Drinking Water Strategic Framework. So this includes a vision as well as a number of goals and steps to achieve those goals to bring water quality and water safety in Nunavut in line with what we are so privileged to experience in southern Canada. So this is a somewhat aspirational document, but it's a way to kind of better understand where money should be getting funneled in order to make these positive changes. And a lot of this is resulting in systems being funded, planning being funded. So it is a document that comes out from the government saying this is what we want to do, but it's also a framework that allows them to allocate money and make these real changes. Okay, so I'd like to move ahead and give you kind of a few examples of what this looks like on the ground. So the first one I want to talk about is Pond Inlet, which is a community that I was very lucky to do a project with back when I was a postdoctoral fellow at Dalhousie University. So I was not leading this as a principal investigator, but I was the lead researcher. So Pond Inlet, or Mitimatalik, is located on Baffin Island on the northern tip. It is like literally the most beautiful place I've ever been in my life. Huge mountains everywhere. I've heard in the past about, oh, the snow has so many different colors depending on where the light is during the day, and it's true there. I mean, you can see the colors just changing across the mountains. It's just spectacular. So what we did in this community is we looked at water from source to tap. So we took samples of the water from the surface water supply. We took it from the water treatment plant right after the chlorination. The only treatment they have there is chlorination. We took water from the truck. We took water from a series of the storage tanks or cisterns. And we also took water from taps. And we analyzed this water for all sorts of different things that are relevant to water safety. This first figure that you see on the screen is demonstrating changes in ATP. That's adenosine triphosphate. And adenosine triphosphate is an indicator of microbial activity. What this means is it's indicative of there being microbes in the water. It doesn't tell us who is there. It doesn't tell us whether or not they're dangerous. But what it does tell us is that there's an environment that is conducive to the growth of microorganisms. So there's a vulnerability there. So a few things to note here. So first of all, if we look at the pump house samples, so those were taken before chlorination. And what you see is there's a change in this ATP over the course of the year. So we have samples going from February 2018 to January 2019. And as you would probably expect, in the summer, we saw a higher concentration of ATP, indicating that in the source water, there was more microbiological activity. This is exactly what we'd expect. So this is a useful way to show that the method we were using is giving us the kind of information we would expect to see and gives us more confidence in the things we saw in the other parts of the system. So we can see that in the truck, which is right after chlorination, the microbial activity is much, much lower, right? And there's maybe a little bit of a change over the course of the year. So right in the summer is a little bit high, but it's still much, much lower than the source water. This indicates that the chlorination is destroying most of the microbial cells that are present in the water. Now, if we get to the cisterns, we see, first off, a lot more variability, right? So, and this makes sense because rather than compared to the truck. So makes sense because we're sampling a whole bunch of tanks, right? And each tank, as you'll see, especially on the next slide, is kind of its own ecosystem, right? It's in its own building. It's subject to its own specific influences. So it's things like temperature, how often do people use the water, how often is the tank cleaned? So we see a bit more variability. But we also see this increase in the summer. So that means that in the summer, some of these tanks are becoming conducive to the growth of microorganisms. Again, this does not give us information about whether or not these microorganisms are dangerous. It just tells us that the conditions exist where microbes can grow. What's interesting is we did not see this at the tap. And so this is a hypothesis. I was not able to prove this in the project, but I suspect that that increase in microbiological activity was at the top of the tank, which is where we took the tank samples, but maybe not so much at the bottom of the tank where there's much less oxygen. And this was supported anecdotally by the fact that there were smells in some of the tanks. And those were the tanks that had the higher microbial activity. So that indicates there was maybe some sort of microbe that was living at the top that was kind of smelly. But again, that's hypothetical, but this data is not. So we definitely had some tanks that were conducive to the growth of microorganisms. Now we did make an attempt to see who was there. This is some results from DNA analysis. Don't worry, you don't have to read the legend right now. So an important limitation of this study is we didn't have an opportunity to do a lot of this DNA analysis. This represents 1 day of sampling. We were looking at a few buildings, but nonetheless, pardon me, the results are interesting. And what's really interesting about them is that most of those columns, which represent different buildings, look different from one another, right? Just like if you look at the colors and the extent to which each color is on each column, it's different. And that kind of confirms this idea of each tank being its own ecosystem. Another thing that's interesting is the pump house, which is the source water, and the truck, which is that water but with chlorine in it, look almost exactly the same, right? So this is not a measure of how much microbial activity is there. It's just telling you like which kinds of organisms might be in there. And those are very, very similar. So it's when the water gets to the tanks that we start to see these ecosystems kind of diverge from one another. We also looked at metals in drinking water. And so this is a graph just showing some results from the lead analysis we did. So lead is a neurotoxin. It's especially dangerous to fetuses and young children. And to give you a sense of kind of what we consider acceptable, the maximum acceptable concentration, or MAC, from Health Canada, which is the recommended highest level that should be in drinking water, is indicated with an orange line there, right? So the first thing that stands out is a lot of the buildings, the amount of lead that we measured in the water was below this level. So, I mean, ideally lead is as low as achievable, but this means that it's doing all right. Like most of these buildings are not impacted by a lot of lead, but there are some buildings that have a lot of lead in the tap water. And something that I want to draw your attention to is that the y-axis here is a log axis. So this, like the difference between 10 and 100 looks like it's, just one step, but that actually means 10 times more. So some of these buildings had very high levels of lead in the tap water. We did some additional sampling to try to understand where in the system this lead was coming from. Unlike southern Canada, there are no pipes in the ground in this community, so it's definitely not coming from lead pipes in the ground. But the kind of testing we did was able to confirm that it was in the plumbing system and to give us a sense of whereabouts in the plumbing system this lead was located. And if you look at the first graph there with the purple lines, that's the lead graph. And this is from two different buildings. And you can see, building 1 clearly has more lead than building 4. Building 1 is a much older building than building 4. But also you can see that they each have a different pattern of where any lead that's coming out in the water is coming from. And to give you a bit of context, that dotted line that you see on each graph is how much lead we measured in the tank water. So this was definitely coming from the plumbing. Okay. So knowing that these challenges exist, what's our next step? How can we better understand what these risks are and apply it kind of beyond a single community? So my team has recently been doing a lot of work with a concept called water safety planning. So this is a concept that was originally developed by the World Health Organization. And it's mostly been applied in smaller communities around the world, though, but it is also used in Alberta, so one of the Canadian provinces. The idea is it's just a framework for understanding water safety. And so it involves things like identifying who's involved with the water system, describing the water supply, identifying different water safety hazards and kind of what we're doing to prevent those from becoming a problem, developing a plan and monitoring to make sure that everything is still working the way we want to. So in our project, here's our step of trying to map the system. And this is the Cambridge Bay drinking water system. So you can see that, like in Pond Inlet, we have a surface water source. It goes through, has some chlorination and then some treatment. There's a lot more treatment in Cambridge Bay than in Pond Inlet. It goes to a treated water storage tank, and then the trucks come by periodically to pick up water, and they bring the water to buildings. And in Cambridge Bay, they also have some piped service. They have a utilidor, which is an above ground pipe that brings water to some of the public buildings, including the high school. So we reviewed basically past information. So information collected through consulting reports by the government itself, and to some extent, just looking at existing records that were on site. And we identified a number of different concerns that existed in the community. We also looked at past water quality data to get a sense of, well, what water quality challenges are being faced in this community right now. So then we wanted to move on to understanding which one of these are more important or less important. So what we did is we assigned scores for past frequency, which is basically, has this happened before? System readiness, is there something in place to try to remove this or deal with this hazard? And how severe would it be if this hazard was in the tap water? So is it catastrophic? Is it a lot of people getting sick or dying? Or is it, well, the water doesn't look great and people are a bit concerned about that? This is not that it's not an issue, but it's just maybe it's a less catastrophic issue. So this helps us to sort out which water safety risks we really have to prioritize right now and which ones we can make plans to deal with on a longer timeline. So here's some of that historical data. It's about manganese. So manganese is just a metal that is commonly found in surface water and some groundwater. And if it does get through to people's taps, it can result in discoloration. Nobody likes that. So the results shown under lake are the manganese levels that have been measured in the past in the surface water source used by the community. The values that say treatment plant are after all of the treatment has been done. And then in the truck is, well, the truck. So you can see that in the lake, it kind of varies from different times that sampling was done. Sometimes they found high manganese, sometimes they found low manganese. It was hard to break down if this was a seasonal difference. I mean, it likely is, because that's usually how manganese kind of cycles in surface water sources. But because the samples were taken at all sorts of different times of year, it was really hard to say, oh yes, this is definitely seasonal. But what we do see is that there's a consistent decrease in the treatment plant and in the truck. And what happened there is that it was determined that, oh, we've got manganese cycling in our source water. We should have some level of manganese treatment at this treatment plant. And so that was instituted. So that represents a barrier to deal with that water safety hazard. And it's working. It's removing the manganese from the source water so that when the water goes to people's taps, it no longer has manganese in it or high levels of manganese. So when we know these kinds of things, when we can come up with these, ratings, basically, risk scores for different hazards, that lets us make a plan for how can we deal with this. So this is just a hypothetical scenario. This was not like linked specifically to Cambridge Bay or any other given community, but it was indicating what would treating manganese look like or dealing with manganese issues look like in a community in Nunavut, and what would that mean for how we would score the risk. So you can see there's different colors. Those correspond to red is high risk, green is low risk, and then there's some in-betweens there. But you can see that initially when we start to institute some fixes, which is going to be more monitoring and better understanding what's going on, we're probably going to find out, since we have like almost no data already, we'll probably find out, we'll understand the problem more, and chances are we'll get more samples that test positive. So we'll see an increase in the risk score, even if we're actually understanding it better. So we're working toward less risk overall. But once we understand what's going on, we can come up with, for example, a treatment system that's going to remove the manganese. And then we continue monitoring that over time. And hopefully we get it so that the risk is lower and lower and lower whenever's associated with that hazard. Okay, so that's on the water quality side. Another challenge that's faced in Nunavut, but also in a lot of small communities across the country, is operator training and making sure that there are people who can operate the system well, who are provided with the training that they need to do that, and who are also, retained. A lot of times these jobs, so operating the water treatment plant, for example, is not as well compensated as maybe as it could be. So oftentimes there is a difficulty retaining people, so making sure that they stay in the job even after they've been trained. So this is an ongoing challenge, again, in Nunavut, but also kind of across the country. So something that my team was able to participate in was the development of the Nunavut Youth Water Operator Training Pilot Program. And we did this in collaboration with the Nunavut Association of Municipalities. And basically how this collaboration looked is that we developed and implemented the curriculum, and they were generously able to fund us to do it. So that was really great. So this served a lot of different purposes. One of the main ones being we wanted to train some youth in the community who could help to support the research, and contribute to that. It was also a way to ensure that some of the knowledge that we were, coming up with in the community remained in the community, and especially with the students that we trained, but also with their families and just kind of generally having the curriculum out there. So this was a very successful program. It was a lot of fun. I went up in April to initiate it with Caroline. You can see Caroline there doing some sampling with the students. And then back in June, but she was there in between to sort of continue the training. And then we were able to hire 2 of the students to work with her through the summer and part of the fall to supplement her own water quality sampling. So they did an amazing job. And so we did some basic lab work. We looked at what are the impacts of permafrost change on water quality. So I saw Victoria in the audience list there. So thank you so much. That was Victoria Carroll who came up with this activity and implemented it. It went really, really well. So we also looked at things like data analysis, and we visited the water treatment plant multiple times. So the students were able to meet the operators and get sort of this hands-on experience of being at the water treatment plant. So honestly, I don't know if any of them are going to choose to be water treatment operators. One of them wants to be an engineer, which is amazing. And so, but still, again, the knowledge is there. They were able to have this experience. I hope that it's something that they can build on. And if nothing else, it got them, a few of them, a summer job. So, and oh yes, and they were also able to present their work at the Nunavut Association of Municipalities, which included the mayors and senior, anyway, some of the senior members of the government in all the municipalities. So that was an amazing opportunity for them, and for them to get that exposure to all of these leaders in the territory. So overall, just a really, really awesome program. All right, so I want to follow, or for kind of end this presentation with a few reflections about the complexity of doing this kind of research in the Arctic as a Southern settler. So I'm a white lady from Hamilton, Ontario. And I've been really lucky. Like I feel like legitimately privileged to have been able to do this work. But I know that, like, I mean, I'm not from the North, right? So what does that really mean when you're doing this research, right? So what is our role here as researchers? Is it, we don't want to be just extracting knowledge and publishing our papers and going away. But are we advocates? Do we kind of work in collaboration with the government to develop, just to get more data? Are we trying to build capacity within communities so they can, advocate for themselves? So it's kind of a lot of that. But again, this is just, I'm not answering the question, actually. I am still trying to work through this. I am hopeful, and I do think that the work we've done is helpful to people. It definitely fills a knowledge gap in terms of just, a lot of communities don't have a lot of water quality data, and our work has resulted in them having water quality data that they can use. But I still think that this question is still important to me, to my team, and I think to most people doing work in the Arctic, no matter where they originally grew up. There's also the question of how do we collaborate meaningfully and respectfully while also meeting expectations of the research community? So basically, how do we ensure that community members are participating and benefiting from our research, right? And so we do that in my team by trying to have a really thought out approach to knowledge mobilization, where we try our best to co-develop research questions, make sure we implement it collaboratively with people on the ground, make sure that everyone's involved to the extent that they want to be in things like data analysis and developing dissemination materials, and making sure that anything that we do get out to the public is available for free so that anyone who wants to know more, especially people who are living in communities in Nunavut, have access to all that data. And then on the other side, though, I mean, I'm up for tenure this year, right? And if I don't get tenure because I haven't, published enough or done enough or been perceived to be doing that, then this whole machine grinds to a halt, right? So there are specific expectations of researchers, and it can be challenging to navigate. But I do feel that I get a lot of support through York University, which I really appreciate. I'm not just saying that because I'm on this talk today, but I really do. And there are a lot of groups in Nunavut who are super, super supportive. And I do feel that some of the changes that NSERC has made in its, approaches to funding have really helped with this too. So I'm feeling pretty positive about what we've done, but I do feel like this is a difficult thing for a lot of academics to navigate, and also for a lot of people in communities to navigate. So this is kind of an ongoing question for myself as well. So what we are doing right now is we've tried to ensure that our sampling activities are in line with community interests and concerns. And right now, Caroline is just finishing up all of her participatory system dynamics workshops and interviews and analyzing the data. So this is where she's actually talking to a lot of people on the ground who have different roles in the water system in Cambridge Bay, and making sure that their understanding of water safety risk is incorporated into our own work. That's all I want to talk to you about today, and I fear I may have gone over time, but I'm looking forward to answering your questions. And I also just wanted to do a quick acknowledgement that even more than the people I had at the very start of the presentation, there are so many people who have contributed to the work that I've presented here today. That includes many members of my own team at York University, as well as a lot of people at Dalhousie, where I did my postdoctoral fellowship, as well as at Laval. I have a great partnership with another Stephanie at Université Laval, and we're doing work in Nunavut, which is in northern Quebec, very similar work. So I literally could not do this work without literally all of these people. So I just want to make sure that they're all acknowledged. We also have some great pictures that were taken by a bunch of different people. All right, I'm going to leave it at that. And I think I'm ready. I'm here for your questions. Oh, sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for a timely and informative talk. I think it's fair to say when we hear and read about safe drinking water in the media, it can be really hard to understand the science behind it and the infrastructure. So thank you for helping break that down for us. You can stop sharing your screen at this time, but we do have time for questions. So want to remind everybody, we've got a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So please do put your questions in there. And for any of you watching live on Facebook, you're welcome to submit any questions or comments through the comment section of the video. Okay, we've already got a few coming through, so I will get started. Could you tell us, how does the cost of water treatment and distribution in Nunavut compare to the national average?
Okay, I don't have a definite number, although I can look it up for you. So if you'd like to follow up, I can get you an actual number. But I can tell you it's at least an order of magnitude, which means at least 10 times more, but can be even higher depending on what kind of treatment you're looking at.
Wow, that's pretty stark. Okay, this one's a bit of a long one, so I'm going to break it up into two. This is an audience question. Because some communities are subject to acute shortages during the year, would it make sense to increase the storage capacity at those sites? And they mentioned, presuming that the only current limitation is current storage size, but could you explain if that is not a correct assumption?
Um, I think that like my initial answer is yes. It is a yes, but that's because I want to explain that there are basically we can think about storage in two ways. So there's storage ahead of treatment, so of the source water, and then we have storage beyond the like after treatment, so like a storage tank, right? And so the storage tank can be really useful for buffering short-term changes in demand, right? So if we have, for example, if there's a fire in the community, right, having a storage tank is really helpful, because then you have
Yeah.
that water right away. You don't have to pump it all, treat it all, send it into a truck. It's like, it's already in a storage tank. So in terms of, I'd say like day to day, up to like a week, the storage tank is really going to be able to buffer those demands. But I was talking a bit about the quantity issue kind of as a community, and that's a storage issue on the source water side. So many communities, not all communities, but many of them have kind of like they have a reservoir. Almost everybody calls it water lake. And it's basically a dammed up stream that it's been dug out so that there's a space for storage. And that's kind of what can run out for that kind of more extended. And that's like a much more dangerous situation when that runs out. Um, and so most of these, like they have backup water sources
Mhm.
that can be used to fill the reservoirs. And this is what they've done in Iqaluit is they've hooked up different backup water sources and actually brought more water into the reservoir. They're looking at more complex solutions in the long term for that, where they will, I believe, and don't quote me on this. I just saw a presentation in December, but I don't have it memorized. But they are looking at, I think, more like connecting those two water sources a bit more permanently so that there's like effectively better storage, like bigger storage. Um, so yeah, I think both are important.
Mhm.
And there's been some good work put out by other researchers, including at Dalhousie, who I have not worked with myself, looking at those different shortages that might be coming. Um, and so there's a lot of work there. I do think it's probably going to be more common, and it's something that is on the radar for a lot of people working there, is that these reservoirs have to be big enough uh, to accommodate demand, but also to account for the fact that things are changing
Mhm.
hydrologically in the north.
Okay. The second part of that question is, would keeping some water in frozen form, so something like using the permafrost to
Mm.
keep a deep tank of water frozen and available when surface water is scarce during the year, would that help at all, or would that be a reasonable cost? Or any other suggestions like that?
So I don't know. I've never heard of that being used intentionally. Water in permafrost is, I think we sometimes do a disservice in the way we talk about groundwater or any water that's in some form of soil. And there's a kind of an image of it being like a lake or something under the ground, but it's actually just like tiny, tiny, tiny amounts of water that are associated with soil particles. So, I mean, it's an interesting concept, but I don't I've never heard of that being implemented, and I don't know how it would work.
All right, great, fair enough. Okay, we have another one from the audience, and they want to thank you for the excellent presentation. And want to know what is known about the microbial communities in the household tanks. Are any of those potential pathogens or sources of toxic metabolites, or is this still all unknown?
It's mostly unknown. So that slide that I showed earlier from the project I led in Pond Inlet, so that was not at the species level, unfortunately. I guess maybe fortunately in terms of messaging, it would have been really difficult to talk about that. But right now we don't have that information. However, there were indicators of some microbes or families of microbes that could be potentially problematic. So the kind that includes cyanobacteria, which can cause cyanobacterial blooms, and we also call those harmful algal blooms.
Mhm.
And so we did find evidence that those might be around. But we don't know exactly which species or whether they're the kind that would put in anything toxic into the water. There have recently been quite a few cyanobacterial blooms in the Northwest Territories, and there are concerns about that in some parts of Nunavut. So that's something that my team has been in touch with the council, the Hamlet Council in Cambridge Bay about, hoping we'll see if they want to explore that further. We are also pursuing a project, or just looking into it right now with the council about looking into who is kind of in the tanks, like what species are there. And we're hopefully going to collaborate with a professor at the University of Pennsylvania who's developed some really cool genomic methods to better understand that. So hopefully I'll be able to tell you in a couple years, but right now I don't have that answer.
Okay, great. And another comment about what a great talk this is and great work that you're doing. Could you touch upon upcoming challenges that you may know of linked to climate change and drinking water?
Yeah. So I almost want to get Victoria, one of my students who I see in the guest list, to comment on this because I think she's got more up-to-date knowledge than I do. But what we've noticed in a lot of parts of Canada is that these changes, they're not all going to be the same everywhere, right? Because the land that the water flows over and interacts with as it goes into a lake or river is different all over the place. And some of the changes that we're going to see due to climate change are not going to be the same everywhere. A good example of that is natural organic matter, which is exactly what it sounds like. So it's like the leftovers of, detritus, leaves, microorganisms after they die, whatever. It can lend kind of like a yellowish color to the water. And in some parts of the Arctic, the changes that are happening in permafrost are resulting in it going up. So there's more, which is problematic because it can interfere with some of our treatment processes, and it can also interact with chlorine to make potentially toxic byproducts. So that's not good news. But in other parts of the Arctic, some of the changes that they're seeing there are actually resulting in less organic matter in the water, right? So it's not, it's a site by site situation. And similarly with things like metals and pathogens and other things. So these are the challenges. They're not going to be the same in every community. But that is what it is. I mean, it's not the same in every community in the South either. I used to work as a consulting engineer for a few years, and when we designed something for a community, we did an in-depth exploration of the source water quality over the multiple years and over seasons. So right now that data doesn't exist for most communities, or any communities really, in Nunavut. So that's kind of a missing link, is like we have to understand what's going on right now so that we can then continue monitoring in a meaningful way as the climate changes and adjust to those changes in terms of the way we treat and manage water. Sorry, that was pretty long-winded, but hopefully that answers your question.
Great, thank you. Is there a difference in water filtration that is needed based on an individual community's need? You actually started just answering this, so it's a great segue into this question. So, actually, they're specifically trying to ask, is the personal biome of a person different based on where they're raised? And should we be using Southern Canada's filtration standards for the North, or are there differences there?
Okay, so two questions. And one of them I can get out of the way because I have no idea. I've heard that about human biomes. I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't know. It's not my area of expertise, and I don't want to speak out of turn. As for should we have the same approach to filtration in the North as in the South, I think that's something, there's a bit of nuance there, because even the Health Canada recommendations for how we treat and manage drinking water acknowledge that, sometimes the capability to remove a given contaminant, it's just not feasible. Like we don't have the technology anywhere. And sometimes some places it's going to be just so expensive that and it might not be possible, right? So there is that, like the logistics in the North are so complex, right? You think about a lot of chemicals and equipment, they have to come up on a barge, right? These are fly-in communities. So it's coming up on a barge once a year. The barge can get delayed by ice. The barge can get the loading of the barge can be slowed down by forest fires, which is what happened at one point for Cambridge Bay, is that they couldn't load stuff up in Northwest Territories because there were too many forest fires. So these are like, it's a major vulnerability, right? So just in that way, sometimes the feasibility is a bit different. But in terms of the science and kind of what should be there, no, there's no difference. There's microbes in the water, in the source water, no matter where you are, anytime it's open to the environment. And we know that certain types of filtration are able to reduce the quantity of microbes in the water.
Mhm.
And so, again, in terms of the science and the best case scenario, there should not be any difference. But in terms of what is feasible, sometimes, compromises do need to be made so that, if the compromise is we have a water filtration system, but it can only operate for a few months a year because otherwise we're going to run out of supplies and we can't, provide the energy or whatever. Like, on one hand, I don't think that's okay,
Mhm.
but it's also, until we find better ways um, to manage those things. And, I'm an engineer. And I often have this spiel about like, we don't need new technologies, we just need better management, more funding, which is true.
Mhm.
But I do feel like there might be some really interesting innovations to be done on how things are transported, how they could be transported. Are there things that could be more modular so that they're less of a problem to get there? Are there maybe chemicals that could be used to do the same thing that are less hazardous and so therefore would be easier to transport? So there might be actually be a lot of innovation there in the future. I think that's a really exciting area to look into. I don't think we need a new filter necessarily, but we might need a filter that's easier to carry somewhere and easier to
Yeah.
maintain.
Okay, that's
Again,
great.
long-winded, sorry, but thank
Yeah,
you for
that's
that question. It's a really interesting one.
I mean, you've got lots of great questions. So I think I appreciate these responses, and certainly lots of things to look forward to. Lots of sounds like more to come in the future. We have another question that also involves thank you for a very nice talk. Um, so two parts. How did the Northern Indigenous community manage to have access to safe water during harsh weather conditions? And noting that they've seen the ATP figure in the lecture, where they've noted that there are higher ATPs in the water tanks at buildings. So did your research group work on how we treat that water by developing a tap water filter? And if not, what would you suggest? And I can repeat that if that was a bit
I
long.
think I've got the basic idea.
Yeah.
So uh, I'm going to try to answer in parts. Okay, so first off, how do people get water in harsh weather? So Inuit have been living in the north for thousands of years at least, and have managed to get water, though it was difficult, right? Life in the north was very difficult. It's not like, I don't think we can avoid acknowledging that. But people did stay alive, right? And in a very, very harsh climate. One of the sources was ice. So older ice is generally very clean. It can get dirty when we remove it and bring it into community and it's exposed to all sorts of other things. But a lot of people like iceberg water. They like the flavor of it. And so people do go out to the icebergs and harvest it. A lot of times younger people go harvest it for the elders, which is great. That's not going to give you the quantity of water that you need to like wash your clothes or flush your toilet, right? But in terms of consumption, that's one thing. A lot of people do use sources on the land, so little streams and whatnot that they know from their own history that they're cleaner than others. One of the people I worked with on the project in Pond Inlet, he actually has a big report on that. So if you're interested, I can send you his report about what he looked at in different streams and whatnot near Pond Inlet. Um, People buy a lot of their water, right? So when I'm up north, I generally buy my water from the co-op, just like in the northern store, most people do. So it's you're bringing a tank, like a little, you know, jerry can home for your consumption needs. So that's how people get water. And sometimes though, if there's a big storm and the trucks can't get out, you just have to make do for a few days until that's over, until they can get the trucks moving again. So that's difficult. That's really difficult for people, especially people with small children who are taking care of elders. So
Mhm.
it's a challenge. Now, the other question was, did we look into developing basically, I think what you're talking about is a point of use treatment system. So we did do a little test with UV LED based treatment. And that was like fine, but it wasn't something that was a priority for the community at that time. And so we didn't really pursue it. There are a lot of existing point of use technologies. So likely many of you have a pitcher filter at home. I do, because I have an old house and I don't know if it has lead in the water and I have little son. So I have a pitcher filter that can remove some lead. So like this is like Brita or Zero Water, those kinds of things. There's also stuff you can put on the tap, either whether they involve UV or they use, usually a carbon filter or something. You can get a reverse osmosis unit or a larger UV system to treat all of the water going through your house. which I know like my in-laws who live in rural New Brunswick, they have a system like that to treat their groundwater. So all of these technologies already exist, and some of them you can like buy at Canadian Tire, like they're not that expensive. So it's not an area where I've put a lot of energy in. Yeah, I have not. I feel that there are a lot of technologies that are already out there, and that we really need right now in Nunavut is more information about the water and kind of where the hazards are. But if this is a project that you're interested in doing, I'm happy to send my papers and any information I can send to help with that process.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, we've got another one related to that. Are there any methods that can be used alongside ATP assays to detect viral contamination in the water?
Wow.
And noting, she wanted to mention it's great to see the operator training being implemented. And the comments coming from somebody who worked with one of your graduate students on a research project in 2023 and remembers that this was all in the works.
Oh.
Mhm.
Yeah, so sorry, I'm all distracted because I love that program too. But so trying to find viral indicators. So there is DNA analysis that can be done for viruses. It's not something I've done myself. When we were looking at that graph that I had with the different DNA results, those were all bacteria, but you can get stuff to do viruses. Um, I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to do that analysis with this professor at University of Pennsylvania. He has something called the pathochip, and it can do bacteria and viruses. So I'll hope to get it more information. But there are also a lot of times, and I don't want to quote anything because I don't really know for viruses what exists out there, but there are usually commercial tests that you can get. I know you can get them for heterotrophic bacteria, E. coli, total coliforms. Like those are relatively simple, relatively portable tests that you can do to get a better sense of kind of who's in there. And specifically with E. coli, for example, the reason we do E. coli is not like, I mean, E. coli can be dangerous, but most E. coli species are not dangerous. But E.
Mhm.
coli, it lives in your gut, so it's an indicator of wastewater influence, basically. And so that means that, you know, there's a danger in the tank and stuff like, or the whatever water sample you're looking at. We've
Mhm.
looked at that. We looked at that in Pond Inlet. We never got any E. coli hits. We had one total coliform hit, but then we did a repeat sample and there was nothing. So, so in that particular study, we didn't see anything else. But sorry, I've gone off topic again. You asked about viruses. I don't know. But if you know about something, I'd love to hear about it. I'm really hopeful that this work will work out with this pathochip thing at University of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Then maybe I'll have more
That-
information in a few years.
That's great. I think I can safely say that everything you're sharing is very interesting, whether it's based on the original question or an offshoot. And then this relates back to when we were talking about some of the connections between the differences in the North and South. Is an audience member wants to know, are you able to leverage your findings in the North to apply to less remote water deprived communities further south? And is there a wider community that you share your knowledge with?
I mean, so yes, I do think that a lot of the things that we've been learning and that we've been trying to apply, in particular, the water safety planning paper that we just published, which was looking at developing a system that would work for Nunavut, but that I think there's a lot of lessons in there in terms of how we define whether something is um, the frequency of a problem versus the presence of a barrier to deal with that problem, and just trying to understand which things should we be prioritizing when it comes to systems where we don't have a lot of background data. So I think sorry, that was really abstract, but I'm happy to send you the paper if you're interested. I also think that there's this participatory system dynamics model that my student Caroline, who is the one who led the work in Cambridge Bay, she's been working on, and that has been, you know, she's still analyzing the data. We're going to see kind of what we can make of it, especially how it could work in an engineering context. But the groups that she worked with, the different stakeholder groups she brought together. So we're talking about like they're definitely community members, government workers, but also like water operators and bringing in the kind of representatives of the municipal government and also the territorial government to talk about what their perceptions of the risks were. I think that could be really powerful. And we're just going to have to kind of see how it goes because one of the things, an anecdote that she was able to pull out of that is that uh, she was doing some of the workshops in conjunction with some of her sampling and some of the sampling that the youth were helping her with. And so, word spread that they were finding certain things,
Mhm.
and specifically copper. So she had some meetings with people who were working with housing and people who were working on the operations side of things for the water. And they were like, hey, we got all these copper pipes and they're causing this problem. Like, let's look at where we have copper pipes. Is there something we could be using? And this was something that they came to, not with Caroline's prompting, but because they were talking to each other during a focus group. So I don't know how we're going to pull out actionable, things that we could apply every single community, but I think it's a really interesting. I think it's going to be really interesting. And
Right.
if you're
Mhm.
familiar with PIVC, or there's a lot of these different approaches to understanding sustainability of like buildings or
Mhm.
of communities or whatever. So this is kind of building on an approach like that where they're talking to a lot of different people and getting you know, their feedback. So seeing it in a water safety context, I think it's gonna be really interesting, but I don't have final results on that because she's just doing the analysis now.
Okay.
Um, and anything else that could go, I mean, anything you find out about a small system, especially
Mhm.
a decentralized one, like we see with the trucks and the cisterns and stuff, there are a lot of parallels with other decentralized systems. So including like the groundwater system that my in-laws use in New Brunswick,
Mhm.
including we did a bit of work with Nova Scotia Parks, looking at some systems in campgrounds. We see a lot of the same challenges, like what kind of sampling should we be using and like what level of historical data exists, usually almost nothing. And so like a lot of the same challenges exist, especially in those decentralized systems.
Okay. Great. Well, that we had a lot of questions, and there were some really interesting answers there. So we are pretty much out of time. I want to thank you again for a really great presentation and for being with us today. You can tell it was a really interesting topic for all of us. So I want to say thank you again, and you can now turn off your video. Actually, before you do that, one thing I can add is you mentioned a few different papers that
Mm.
people could get. So if anyone wants anything, you can email alumni@yorku.ca and we can connect you to Stephanie to get some of those papers. And that is it. I will let you go now and you can turn off your video.
Thank
And for
you.
the audience, thanks again. We do have one more poll question for you. How would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following this discussion now that you've heard the discussion? It should pop up on your screen right now. And while you are responding to that, I wanted to let you all know that Scholars Hub will be back on Wednesday, February 12th, with Peter Bax, Professor of Biology, and his presentation is going to be on heart health. In addition, you can join us for our second February session celebrating Black History Month on February 26th with Sylvia Bawa, Associate Professor of Global Sociology, and her discussion on truth commissions as mechanisms for civic inclusion. If you're looking for other engaging discussions, make sure to check out York Circle, where you will hear from York's leading faculty members on a wide range of interesting topics. Our next York Circle will take place on March 22nd, so you can stay tuned for more information. And to register for any of these events or learn more about upcoming sessions, please visit yorku.ca/alumni and friends, and we're going to share that in the chat. And that is it for today. Thank you very much for joining us and be well. Enjoy the rest of your day.